So this week, I think, is going to be a pretty important week in the COVID fight, certainly in recent history, where it appears that new booster vaccines are going to be recommended for everyone, I believe, 12 and older, at least for the Pfizer vaccine. And those are going to be a bivalent combination of the original virus vaccine plus a vaccine that's developed against the spike protein of BA5, which is essentially the same spike protein as BA4. So those are relatively interchangeable. But I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about how we got to this point and what we know and what we don't know about how we got here. I don't know who Jack Septisay is, but apparently, if you're a big fan of his, this is a must-see movie. So first of all, the context again of why many experts and myself included are still pushing vaccines and boosting so heavily. And so this was from a Kaiser Foundation in monograph that came out a couple of months ago, but it looked at U.S. Leading causes of death. And just as a reminder, the oh so mild Omicron virus that many were talking about in late 2021 and early 2022 was the leading cause of death for all U.S. adults between the ages of 45 and 84, and was the second leading cause of death in adults between the ages of 25 and 44 during the month of January of 2022 at the peak of Omicron. So obviously, these viruses not so mild. So I know we talk about the fact that not as many kids and young adults die, thankfully, as do older folks from COVID. But the reality is, in general, not many people in those age groups die. So when you look at causes of death, as you can see, COVID was still high up there. Even for kids, it was the fourth leading cause of death in January of 2022, and has been the fourth leading cause of death for adolescents for much of the pandemic. This is just a graph over time showing the time series of COVID mortality. And you can see for a period of time during the peak of fall and winter 2020 and 2021, COVID was the leading cause of death for a couple of months across the US for all age groups. And you can see that in the Omicron wave, it was number 2 and approached the number 1 heart disease. So again, we're still seeing huge impacts when these recent variants have high spiking waves. The next piece of information to keep in mind is that the vaccines are still quite effective at reducing hospitalization and death. So if you look at hospitalization data, you can see here, this is age adjusted. So it's kind of taking into account differences in ages and using kind of the aggregate risk. And you can see for all ages, if you're unvaccinated, you're about 4.5 times more likely to end up in the hospital compared to a similar population who is fully vaccinated plus boosters, so up to date for vaccines. And that's obviously a huge difference, but it's not as big of a difference as what we saw back at the peak of the Omicron wave, where there was a 13-fold reduction in that risk. So it's unclear. Those protective factors tend to get amplified in very high activity periods for various reasons, but it's also probably true that the effectiveness of the vaccines is waning over time as people are farther out from their last dose of booster than they were in January 2022. And also with new variants like BA2 and now BA4 and 5, we know that the effectiveness is dropping as well. Now, if you look at the specific age groups, you can see that the effectiveness does seem to correlate with when new doses of boosters were made available for those populations. So these are Americans over the age of 65, and you can see that you had a dramatic jump up when the first booster recommendation came out, and a significant proportion of those folks got a first booster back in late September, early October. And then the second booster recommendation that came out in late March, you can see again, a pretty significant jump in the protective factor that occurred in this age group over the age of 65. This is reflected also in folks between the ages of 50 and 64, who also were eligible for these boosters. And when you get down into younger adults between the ages of 18 and 49, maybe slightly less prominent, but still there, and also seems to reflect that expanded recommendation. So it was a little while before folks under the age of 50 without comorbidities were made eligible for a booster dose. As you can see there, that was in, I believe, late November. And then the second booster dose was made only available to folks with immunocompromising conditions in that age group. But again, you saw a pretty significant jump. No real significant jumps in protective factors for adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17. So they got their initial doses in September of 2021, and you can see their protective factors remained relatively constant. They were eligible for boosting, and I should have put the arrow in there around April, I believe. However, very limited uptake in that age group. And then if you look at younger kids, again, a similar pattern, but less pronounced recent jumps because we're not boosting in that population. It's also true that the impact is even more so potentially when you look at mortality compared to just hospitalization. And you can see that from the most recent data we have as of June of 2022, if you were unvaccinated, you had a 14-fold increased risk of dying from COVID than people who were vaccinated and up to date. So 2 or more booster doses for those over the age of 50, who were obviously the highest risk group. But that protective factor dropped considerably if you were looking at, that threefold is the second booster, how much protective effect that adds over people who just had 1 booster dose. So it goes to show that that second booster, in terms of an additional dose and probably also more recent immunization, was important in increasing protection even over 1 booster dose. But we're doing a pretty poor job in terms of getting additional people added to those rosters of at least a primary series or boosted. As you can see, we really haven't had a major jump in boosting really since the beginning of this year of 2022. And even the folks who became eligible for boosting in the young children for fully vaccinated, for kids between the ages of 6 months and 5 years, and then 5 to 11 years, you can see in January 2022 starts to kick up, and we're really still only at 38% having 1 dose, 30% having 2 doses. And in younger kids, you can see under the age of 5, we're really doing terribly in terms of the number that we've had fully vaccinated. The same is true with boosting. We haven't had a significant number of folks boosted really since the beginning of this year, other than the second booster for folks age 50 and up. And you can see there, 65 and older, we have about 40% with the second booster, and 50 to 64, only about 25% with the second booster. So again, all told, as we've discussed before, only about between 12 and 15% of Americans have had a dose of vaccine within the last 6 months. Now, in that setting, recently the administration has announced its intent to launch a booster campaign to make an additional booster dose available to everyone, apparently from the ages of 12 on up, and to make that booster a bivalent vaccine, which would contain half of it would be the original vaccine preparation, and half of it would be a vaccine developed against the spike protein, again, of BA4 and 5. And that has been telegraphed in a number of media announcements and other events by the administration, by the FDA and CDC. And in fact, the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices is going to meet at the end of this week, and apparently to discuss these vaccines and make the recommendation that they be used. Now, this is a little bit of a departure, again, from how things traditionally and typically are supposed to happen, where the FDA's advisory committee, the VRBPAC, meets first to discuss the science of the vaccines and approval, and that then goes to the FDA commissioner, who then gives the approval from the FDA side. Then it goes to CDC's ACIP, and finally to the CDC director. This is going to be apparently kind of a condensed timeline, where the FDA director is going to make that decision without the VRBPAC weighing in, and ACIP is going to make their deliberation and determination at the end of this week. And by this weekend, we may have approval and recommendations that these vaccines be used. So how did we get to this point where we're using BA4, BA5 bivalent vaccine? And again, the submission from Pfizer officially came only a week ago, not that long ago. And the administration, again, had already made commitments between Pfizer and Moderna to buy over 170 million doses of these vaccines. So here's some data that was kind of accumulating over the last 6 months that led to this. First of all, a number of studies now showing that neutralizing antibody titers against BA4 and 5 from folks who've been vaccinated and boosted are much lower than they are against original strain viruses and some of the earlier variants. So again, just to remind everyone, neutralizing antibody titers, essentially you take the serum from somebody, either they've been vaccinated and boosted, they've been infected previously, then you put it in a test tube with cells and different viruses you're testing against, and you see how well those antibodies block those viruses from infecting cells and causing them to die. And so the higher your neutralizing antibody titer, the better your antibody binds and neutralizes the virus's ability to infect and kill cells. And what we see is much lower titers of neutralizing antibodies against BA4/5 viruses from folks who've been vaccinated and boosted when you compare how active they are against other viruses like the original D614G or BA1 or BA1.1 or BA2. You can see there, compared to the original virus, the D614G, about a 20-fold reduction in neutralizing antibody titers. And even when you compare to BA2, about a 4-fold reduction, right? So that means that the antibodies work about 4 times less well against BA4/5 as they do compared to BA2. So we know that recent variants just are not as well neutralized by antibodies that folks have from vaccination or prior infection. Again, this study showed that a significant drop-off from the original virus to BA1, and then an even farther drop-off from BA1 to BA2, and then BA5, as you can see there in the blue arrow. That was true for people who were vaccinated and boosted, and then also true for people who were vaccinated and then had a BA1 infection, so a BA1 breakthrough. So essentially, that you can think of that as then being vaccinated with BA1 vaccine, right? If you get infected with the BA1 virus, it's similar. And you can see that compared to BA1 neutralizing titers, you still have a significant decrease in that blue arrow here in the third panel of neutralizing antibody titers against BA4 and 5. So that means that even when you're infected with BA1, the antibodies in your serum still don't bind and neutralize BA4/5 nearly as well as it does to other viruses. And so we know that that neutralizing antibody titers has some relationship to how protected you are against severe disease and death. Certainly at a population level, those are more meaningful. On an individual basis, it's still not necessarily perfectly predictive. Another study published in the New England Journal recently showed, again, that neutralizing antibody titers against BA4/5 are much lower than they are against BA1 after vaccine boosting. And again, even people who were infected with BA1 or BA2, so consider that, kind of vaccinated with a BA1 or BA2 variant, still you have a statistically significant drop in neutralizing antibody titer against BA4 and 5. So we know, again, that BA4 and 5 has more immune escape from prior immunity than any of the other variants we've seen before. Finally, this paper I talked about last week, again, just showing the same phenomenon, 7.5-fold reduction in neutralizing antibodies compared to BA1 when you look at BA4 and 5. That's in previously unvaccinated folks, and even in people with previous vaccination, you can see about a 2.5 to 3-fold reduction in neutralizing antibody titer against BA4/5. So again, immune escape pretty evident in all of the studies that have occurred. And so going back to June, then, when the FDA and first heard data from the vaccine manufacturers about new variant vaccines, the emphasis at that point was really on original Omicron or BA1 vaccines. So obviously the companies had several months to work on these by June. They had started this work in late November, early December. And so it had 6 months at that point to develop not only the vaccines, but human data as well. And that's what was discussed mostly at this June 28th meeting of VRBPAC. And so VRBPAC saw the data from, and this is from Pfizer again, but showing that immunity from 2 and even 3 doses of vaccine was waning significantly over time. And you can see that waning was much more prominent when you looked at Omicron, newer variants compared to Delta. And that red arrow there shows that even after 3 doses over 5 months or so, you still had a pretty profound drop in protection, at least against symptomatic COVID. Now, protection against hospitalization and death still quite a bit higher, but this is showing that vaccine effectiveness over time really decreasing. So the data that Pfizer presented to the FDA back in late June was then looking at boosting additional booster doses, again, a 4th booster dose with either the original vaccine, that's that BNT162b2, or vaccine that included Omicron specific vaccine. So that's a boost with a monovalent Omicron. And what you saw is between a 1.5 and a 2-fold increase in neutralizing antibody titers against the BA1 virus compared to boosting with the original vaccine. So it showed that boosting with the Omicron variant vaccine gave you an advantage. And this was in, folks between the ages of 18 and 55. When they looked at older folks, similar study, again, boosting with either the original vaccine again, or with a monovalent Omicron, or with a bivalent. So again, half of it being the original virus, half of it being the BA1 variant virus in the vaccine. And again, showing a pretty significant jump in titers from pre-vaccine, pre-boosting to post-boosting, but then again, showing a significant jump when you were looking at Omicron versus the original, and the Omicron monovalent versus the bivalent seemed to be relatively similar. So again, compared to boosting with the original version of the vaccine, you got anywhere between a 1.5 and 3-fold increase in neutralizing antibody titers when you included an Omicron variant in the vaccine. Now, interestingly, if you look at these numbers, it does seem to correlate how high your neutralizing antibody titer jumps up, seems to correlate more with how much Omicron variant vaccine is included in there. So if you look at the monovalent, obviously, if you're boosting with 30 micrograms of the monovalent, you're getting 30 micrograms of the Omicron virus. If you're boosting with 60, you're getting 60 micrograms of Omicron. In the bivalent, if you're vaccinating with a 60 microgram vaccine, that means half of it is the original and half of it is Omicron. So only 30 micrograms of that is Omicron. And in the bivalent 30 microgram dosing there, only 15 micrograms of that is Omicron. So again, that has the lowest increase in titer compared to the others. Nevertheless, the decision has been made to go with that combined bivalent at 30 micrograms. Now, the kicker, I think, from that June 28th meeting was, as you can see, these were backup slides that Pfizer just showed to the VRBPAC folks and the FDA, just to say, hey, we've got some additional data that might be interesting to you. And this was mouse data looking at a BA.5 variant vaccine. So again, looking at a different vaccine that was directed against BA.5 and showing the difference in neutralizing antibody titers in mice. And what you see is compared to that blue, where that was mice that were boosted with the original vaccine, those red arrows show mice that were vaccinated and were boosted with either a monovalent BA.4/5 or a bivalent BA.4/5. And you can see a pretty significant jump in neutralizing antibody titer, almost a log there for the monovalent compared to the original. And so this was the first data that showed that BA.4/5 for vaccine for that particular variant may have a profound effect. And then the next slide was showing the advantage that a BA.4/5 booster had over a BA.1 booster in neutralizing the BA.4/5 viruses. And again, you can see about a log difference from the monovalent BA.4/5. So 11.3-fold increase compared to the Omicron BA.1 booster. So that BA.1 booster, again, was the data they presented in humans. That was kind of what everybody thought was going to be the FDA approved plan, but just these few slides of data showing that, well, you know what, in mice, the BA.4/5 booster seems to have an advantage for the more recent variants of BA.4/5. And 2 days later is when the FDA came out with this new recommendation that essentially told the vaccine manufacturers, go back and make BA.4/5 variant vaccines. And that's what we're going to approve for the next round. So over the last 2 months, that's what the vaccine companies have been doing, focusing on those BA.4/5 vaccine boosters. But the issue is, with that short period of time, they haven't had time to do all of the human clinical trials as they did when they presented that BA.1 booster data in June. So from a safety perspective, that's, you know, the manufacturing process, the vaccines themselves are essentially the same, other than for a few differences in the sequence of BA.1 versus BA.4/5. And so, you know, based on the experience we've had with now, you know, hundreds of millions of these vaccines being given in the US and 10 billion or so being given worldwide, maybe a little bit less for the mRNA vaccines, but well over 5 billion doses of those vaccines being given worldwide. The FDA is now approaching this similar to how they do with influenza vaccines, where small changes of the flu vaccine from year to year don't require an entire new set of human clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy. If you can show in your preclinical data that the vaccines seem to approximate each other and then show advantage in effectiveness there, that's all the FDA needs. And so those are the data that are apparently going to go, are going to be considered by the FDA commissioner and giving these vaccines approval, and then what will be presented to the ACIP at the end of this week. So that tells you how we got to where we are with the current BA.4/5 booster. Again, what's expected is by the end of this week, that bivalent vaccine, so a 30 microgram vaccine, half of it will be the original vaccine, half of it will be a vaccine directed against BA.4/5. And so far, the administration has indicated that many tens of millions of doses will be ready to fly off the shelves immediately. And so I anticipate that just about everybody who wants one of these vaccines will be able to get one within the next couple of weeks. And again, because of the relationship of recency of vaccination and number of vaccine doses that one has received in providing protection against hospitalization and death, I think it's imperative for everyone who's eligible for one of these vaccines, again, everybody over the age of 12, to go out and get one. So that's where we are, and hopefully we'll see some good progress over the next week.